"You are trembling," said the Duke of Belcourt, and Eleanor, standing at the far side of the vast, cold bedchamber on her wedding night, thought that she had never in her life heard a gentler voice come out of a face so feared. She had been married to him that morning. She had been married to the most feared man in the north, Nathaniel, Duke of Belcourt, whom they called the Black Duke, whom they called the Beast of the Border, whom mothers used to frighten their children, and whom she herself had dreaded for the whole of the 6 weeks since her father had signed the contract that gave her to him. She had wept for those 6 weeks, privately, where no one could see. She had prayed for a reprieve that did not come. She had walked to the altar that morning on her father's arm with her whole body cold as death, and she had spoken her vows in a voice she scarcely recognized, and she had not once been able to look up at the tall, dark, silent man beside her, because she was too afraid of what she would see. The wedding itself she remembered only in pieces, the way one remembers a fever, the cold stone church full of strangers who had come to see the beast take a bride. Her father's arm shaking beneath her hand, for he was not a wicked man, only a weak one who had gambled away everything and wept the night he told her what he had arranged, and begged her forgiveness and been forgiven, because she loved him and there was nothing else to be done. The long walk up the aisle toward the tall, dark, motionless figure at the altar rail, the Duke's voice, when at last she heard it in his vows, low and steady and giving nothing away, her own voice thin and strange, the cold weight of the ring, and through all of it the certainty, sitting in her stomach like a stone, that she was walking into a life of misery and fear, sold to a monster to pay her father's debts, and that no one in the whole crowded church would lift a finger to save her, because she was only a woman, and women were bought and sold every season. And no one thought it worth remarking upon. She had not looked him once. She had been too afraid. And so she had come to her wedding night knowing nothing of the man she had married except the terrible things the world said of him, and the world, she had been given to understand, was seldom kind and never wrong, and now the wedding was over, and the guests were gone. And the great doors of Belcourt had closed behind the last of them, and she stood in the bedchamber that was to be hers with her back nearly to the wall, and the man she had married stood across the room from her, and she was trembling so hard she could hear her own teeth, and she was waiting. Waiting for the cruelty everyone had promised her, waiting for the beast to show himself. But he had not crossed the room. He had not touched her. He stood by the fire, a great dark shape against the flames, and he had said only, in that low, unexpectedly gentle voice, "You are trembling." Eleanor could not answer. Her throat had closed. Nathaniel, Duke of Belcourt, looked at his bride, at the girl of 21 who had been sold to him by a father drowning in debt, who had wept through her own wedding, who stood now pressed against the wall of his bedchamber, white-faced and shaking like a hare run to ground, and something in his hard, closed, terrible face changed. He did not move toward her. Instead, deliberately, he moved away, crossed to the great chair by the fire, the one furthest from her, and sat down in it, unhurried, and folded his scarred hands, and looked at her with an expression she could not read across the width of the room. "Come and sit by the fire," he said. "You are cold, and it is warm here, and I will not come near you. I give you my word." She did not move, Eleanor. It was the first time he had said her name, and he said it very softly, as one speaks to a frightened animal. "I know what they have told you about me. I have heard it all myself over the years. A man hears the things that are said of him. The Black Duke, the Beast. I know you have been dreading this night as you would dread the grave, and I know you came to that altar this morning believing you were being given to a monster. I cannot undo 6 weeks of dread in an evening. But I can tell you one thing, and I am going to tell it to you now, and I am going to spend however long it takes to make you believe it." He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, and the firelight across his hard face, and made it, for a moment, almost kind. "You are safe with me. Do you hear me? You are safe with me. Nothing will happen in this room tonight, or any night that you do not freely wish. Not tomorrow. Not ever. I did not marry you to frighten you. Whatever they have made me in the telling, I am not that. And I would rather you knew it than anything else in the world." Eleanor stared at him across the cold room, and the trembling did not stop all at once, but something in her, some tight-wound spring of terror that had been coiled for 6 weeks, loosened just slightly at the plain, quiet certainty in his voice. They said she managed, and her voice came out cracked and small. They said you killed your first wife. The Duke was silent for a moment. Then he said, without flinching, my first wife died in childbed, and the child with her, 7 years ago, and I was in the room, and I could not save either of them, and I have not forgiven myself for it, and I never will. That is the truth of it. The rest, the whispers, the beast, the tales they tell, grew up around a man who shut himself away after and let no one near enough to know better. I gave them nothing to correct the story with, so the story grew. It suited me for a time to be feared. It kept people at a distance, and I wanted people at a distance, because the last time I let anyone close, I watched her die and could do nothing. He looked into the fire. So there is your monster, Eleanor. A man who grieves, and who has let himself be called a beast because it was easier than being pitied. I am sorry the tales frightened you. I would give a great deal to have them untold. Eleanor did not know what she had expected. She had expected cruelty, or coldness, or the leering menace of the creature the ballads made of him. She had not expected this wary, honest, grief-worn man who sat as far from her as the room allowed and told her, unprompted, the saddest thing about himself, so that she need not be afraid. Slowly, still watching him, she came away from the wall. She did not go to the fire. She was not ready for that. But she came a few steps into the room, and she saw his shoulders ease very slightly when she did, as though her small movement toward him had been a gift. Why did you marry me? She asked. If you do not want a wife, he almost smiled, did not quite reach. The same reason you married me, I imagine. I was made to. Not by debt in my case, but by duty. I am the last of my line. And there is an estate and a title, and a great many people who depend upon Belcourt, and my lawyers and my aged aunt and the whole apparatus of my rank have been pressing me these 7 years to marry again and secure it all, and I resisted as long as I could, and at last I gave way. Because a man in my position cannot resist forever. Your father's difficulty was known to my agent. It was arranged. I confess I did not think overmuch about the girl at the far end of the arrangement. I thought of it as I think of all my duties, coldly, as a thing to be done. He looked at her, and now the firelight showed something in his face that was almost shame. And then you came up the aisle this morning white as death and shaking, and would not look at me, and I understood for the first time what I had done, that I'd let myself become a thing so feared that a girl would weep to be given to me. And I was ashamed, Eleanor. I have not been ashamed of anything in 7 years, and I was ashamed this morning watching you dread me. So, that is why we are married, and that is what I felt watching you wed me, and I have now due a great deal more truth than a man usually tells his wife on their wedding night, and I find I do not regret it. Eleanor came another step closer. The fire was warm now on her face. The Duke had not moved from his chair. He sat quite still, giving her all the room in the world. You may have the bed, he said. I will sleep in the dressing room tonight and every night, until you tell me otherwise, if you ever tell me otherwise, which you are under no obligation to do. I will make no claim on you that you do not freely grant. We can live as strangers under one roof, if that is what you wish. Many people do and manage well enough. Or we can, in time, if you should ever come to wish it, learn to be something more than strangers. But that will be your choice, Eleanor, and yours alone, and it will not be tonight, and there is no hurry in the world. You have been afraid a long time. Be unafraid a while, before anything else. That is all I ask. And he rose and bowed to her, actually bowed, gravely, as though she were a queen and not a debtor's daughter he had bought. And he took a candle and crossed to the door of the dressing room and paused there and said, "Good night, Duchess. Sleep. You are safe. I will be just here. And I will not come through this door. And if you need anything in the night, you have only to call. And if you never wish to call, that is well too." And he went through and closed the door softly behind him, and Eleanor stood alone by the fire in the great warm room, her wedding night, and found that she was weeping again, but not, this time, from fear. She slept in the end more soundly than she had slept in 6 weeks. In the days that followed, the Duke of Belcourt kept every word he had given. He slept in the dressing room. He came to her at breakfast and inquired courteously after her rest and did not touch her, not so much as her hand. He gave her the run of the great house and its gardens and its library, a vast, dim, wonderful library that had not been opened in years, and which she discovered by accident on the third day and could not tear herself away from. And when he found her there, curled in a window seat with a book, he did not disturb her, only had a fire lit in the cold hearth and a lamp brought, and went quietly away, and left the room to her. He assigned her a maid, a kind, sensible woman named Bess, who had been at Belcourt 30 years, and who told Eleanor, in the way of maids, that his Grace was the best master in the north, and the most wronged man in England, and that the tales told of him were a wickedness, and that she had watched him grieve 7 years, and had prayed nightly for someone to come and thaw him, and had not dared hope it might be so gentle a someone as the new Duchess. Eleanor did not know what to make of any of it. She had braced her whole soul for a beast, and had found instead a courteous, silent, sorrowing man who arranged fires for her comfort and asked nothing of her at all, and she found the not knowing harder, in some ways, than fear would have been. She watched him. She could not help but watch him. She watched him with his tenants, when she chanced to see it, watched the feared Duke of Belcourt kneel in a cottage doorway to speak gently to a sick old man, watched him carry a lamb from a ditch with his own 2 scarred hands, watched him listen, really listen, to the troubles of people who had nothing to offer him but their troubles. She watched him with his horses and his dogs and his aged aunt, who scolded him roundly and whom he bore with a patience that spoke of deep affection. And slowly, over the first weeks of a marriage that was no marriage at all, Eleanor came to understand that the monster she had dreaded did not exist, had never existed, and that the man she had actually married was lonelier and kinder and sadder than anyone she had ever known. The aged aunt sought her out in the second week. Lady Aurelia, a small, fierce, upright old woman with a cane and a tongue like a whip, who cornered Eleanor in the long gallery and looked her up and down with 2 sharp black eyes. "So you are the girl they have frightened half to death," she said. "I can see it. You have the look of a creature waiting to be struck. Well, you may stop waiting. My nephew has many faults. He is stubborn, and he broods, and he has let the whole north believe a pack of lies about him out of sheer grieving pride. But he has never in his life raised his hand or his voice to a woman, and he never will, and if you doubt it you have only to look at how he tends the least of his tenants." The old woman's face softened, very slightly. "I buried his mother, and I stood by him when he buried his wife and his child, and I have watched him turn to stone this 7 years and grieved to see it. And then he brought you home, and the very next morning he asked me, mind, who have not been consulted on anything in a decade, how a man might make a frightened girl feel safe under his roof. He has not asked how to make anyone feel anything since before his wife died. So do not tell me he is a beast, child. I know beasts. He is only a broken man, and you, if you are half as sensible as your eyes suggest, are the mending of him. Now sit and pour my tea, and tell me about yourself, for I mean to like you, and I am seldom wrong once I have decided." Eleanor poured the tea, and told the old woman about herself, and was liked, and went away that afternoon with a great deal to think about. She began, tentatively, to speak to him. It started with the library. She could not keep the books to herself. They were too wonderful. And he was the only other reader in the house, and one evening at dinner, they dined together at his insistence, though at the 2 ends of a very long table, which she had come to find faintly absurd. She asked him about a volume of travels she had found, and he answered her, and they fell to talking, and talked for 2 hours, and she forgot to be afraid, and when she remembered, halfway through describing a passage that had delighted her, that she was speaking freely and warmly to the beast of the border, she stopped, startled at herself, and he saw it, and said only, "Gently, go on. I like to hear you. I have not heard anyone speak in this house of anything but duty in a very long time." And she went on. After that they talked every evening. He moved his place at the table nearer to hers, 1 seat at first, and then another over the course of a fortnight. So gradually she scarcely noticed, until one night she realized he was sitting at her right hand and had been for a week, and that she had not minded, had in fact been glad of it, had begun to look forward all day to the evening's talk. He told her of the estate and of Belcourt's long history, slowly, in pieces, on the evenings when the grief came near of his first wife, whom he had loved, and of the child that had never lived, and of the 7 years of silence after, and Eleanor told him of her own life, of her feckless dear father and her dead mother and her small hopes, and found that he listened to her exactly as she had watched him listen to his tenants, as though her troubles mattered, as though she mattered, which no one had made her feel in a very long time. There was an evening that autumn that she came afterward to think of as the first she had truly happy at Belcourt. A great storm had come up at dusk, wild and battering, and the wind howled in the old chimneys and rattled every casement, and Eleanor, who had never loved storms, found she did not mind this one at all, for the Duke had proposed, gravely, that on such a night the only sensible course was to sit by the largest fire in the house and read aloud, and he had chosen a book, and he read to her, his low voice steady beneath the wind, the firelight on his hard face gone gentle, and she had curled in the great chair opposite with a shawl about her shoulders and watched him and listened, and thought, with a kind of wonder, that if anyone had told her 6 weeks ago that she would spend a stormy night in perfect contentment listening to the beast of the border read her a book, she would have thought them mad. He read well. He read as a man reads who loves the words, and when he came to a passage that was sad, his voice caught just slightly, and she understood that the passage had touched some private grief in him, and she did not remark on it, only rose quietly and put another log on the fire, so that he might have a moment to master himself. And when she sat down again, he looked at her over the top of the book with an expression of such naked gratitude that she had to look away, 'cause it made her heart do something she was not yet ready to name. "You need not read on, if it grieves you," she said softly. "It does not grieve me," said Nathaniel, "or it does a little, but it is a good grief tonight. I have read alone in this house for 7 years, Eleanor, and I did not know until this hour how much the reading wanted a listener. You are a very great gift, and you do not even know you are given it. Sit, and let me go on. I find I do not want the storm to end." And she sat, and he went on, and the storm did not end for a long while, and neither of them wished it to. They walked too as the weeks warmed toward the turning of the season, in the great neglected gardens of Belcourt, which the Duke had let run wild after his wife died, and which Eleanor, with his glad permission, began quietly to bring back to life. He walked with her among the overgrown roses in the long light of the afternoons, and once, reaching past her to hold back a thorn branch so it should not catch her sleeve, his hand brushed hers, and both of them went still, and neither drew away at once. And then he did draw away, careful as ever, and said nothing, but his colour was high and hers was higher, and they walked the rest of the path in a silence that was not uncomfortable at all, but full and warm and new. That night she lay awake a long time, aware of the small warm memory of his hand against hers, and did not know whether to be glad or troubled that she could not stop thinking of it, and decided at last, drifting towards sleep, that she was glad. The dread was long gone. She noticed, one day, with a small shock, that she had stopped watching the door of the dressing-room at night with any fear at all, and had begun, instead, she blushed to admit it even to herself, to be aware of him through it on the other side, so near and so scrupulously distant, and to wonder. The turning of it, when it came out of danger, as such things often do. It was late autumn, and a fever came through the district, a hard, quick fever that took the old and the young, and Belcourt, unlike many great houses, did not close its gates against it. The Duke rode out among his sick tenants day after day, carrying medicines and food and his own untiring presence, and Eleanor, who had learned enough of nursing at her mother's long deathbed to be of use, insisted, over his objection, the first time she had ever openly opposed him. On going with him, he had tried to forbid it. "It is dangerous, Eleanor. I will not risk you. You risk yourself every day," she had said, standing very straight, "and I find I will not be left safe at home wondering whether you will come back. I am your wife. If you go into the fever, I go too. That is my choice, and you told me my choices were my own." And he had looked at her a long moment, and something had moved in his hard face, and he had said low, "So I did," and had not forbidden her again, and they had gone out together into the sickness side by side, and worked in the poor cottages until they could barely stand. There was a particular cottage she remembered, of all the sick they tended in those hard autumn weeks, the home of a widow named Martha Ford, whose 2 young ones had both taken the fever and who was herself too worn with nursing them to stand. Eleanor and the Duke had come at dusk and found the fire out and the little ones burning and the widow past her strength, and Eleanor had watched her feared husband do a thing she never afterward forgot. He had taken off his fine coat and rolled his sleeves and built the fire himself, and drawn water, and sat on the earthen floor of a poor woman's cottage with a sick little one in his own arms through half the night, cooling the small hot brow with a patience that never faltered, while Eleanor tended the other and the widow slept at last. He had not spoken much. He had not needed to, and near dawn, when the worst had passed and both little ones breathed easy and the widow woke to find a Duke asleep, sitting up against her wall with her child safe in the crook of his arm, Eleanor had looked at the man she had been taught to dread, and had felt the last stone of her old fear dissolve entirely, and had thought, they called him a beast, and he is the gentlest man in England, and I am the only one, or nearly, who has been let close enough to know it. It had felt in that poor cottage in the grey dawn, like a secret she had been given to keep, and she meant to keep it all her life. She had told him so, walking home in the cold morning. "You are not what they say you are." "No," he had said simply. "But I stopped troubling to correct them long ago. It seemed easier to be feared than to be known, I think." He had glanced at her, and away. "I think I did not much wish to be known, until lately. Being known means being close, and being close means the possibility of loss, and I had had enough of loss. But you have rather undone all that, Eleanor. You have got close without quite noticing how, and now I find I would rather be known by you than feared by all the world, which is a great change in a man, and I lay it entirely at your door." And she had not known what to say to that, and had said nothing, and they had walked the rest of the way home in the growing light, with a new thing standing warm and unspoken between them. And it was only a few weeks later that the fever took her, and made the unspoken thing plain at last. Was Eleanor who took the fever, in the end, not him. She fell ill on a wet November night, and the fever took her hard and fast, as it had taken others, and for 3 days and 3 nights she burned and raved and hovered at the edge of the dark, and the great house of Belcourt held its breath. And through all of it, through the worst of it, when the physician shook his head and Bess wept openly, and it seemed the Duchess might follow the Duke's first wife into the ground, Nathaniel, Duke of Belcourt, did not leave her side. He sat by her bed hour upon hour, day and night, and cooled her brow with his own scared hands, and held her when the shaking took her, and talked to her low and steady when she could not hear him, and when the physician told him gently that he must rest or he would fall ill himself, he said in a voice that brooked no argument, that he had sat by one deathbed helpless 7 years ago and lost everything, and that he would not sit helpless again, and that if the fever meant to take his wife it would have to take him first, and it would find him fighting. She heard him at the very bottom of the fever, when she could hear nothing else. She heard his voice through the dark, steady and unbroken, saying her name, saying, "Stay, Eleanor, stay, I am here, you are safe, come back to me," and she came back. On the 4th morning the fever broke, and she opened her eyes in the grey dawn light to find the Duke of Belcourt asleep at last in the chair beside her bed, his head fallen against the counterpane, his hand still holding hers as though he had held it through the whole long night and had not let go even in sleep, and his hard feared face unguarded, streaked with the salt of tears he would never have let her see waking. Eleanor lay very still so as not to wake him, and looked at the sleeping man who had fought the Daher for 3 days, and she understood, with a clarity that the fever seemed to have burned into her, exactly and entirely what had happened to her heart, and she was not afraid of it at all. He woke, and found her looking at him, and his whole face changed, relief so vast and naked it undid her to see it, and he said her name like a prayer, and then, catching himself, drew back, careful even now, even here, to give her room. "You are awake, thank God. You are. The fever has broken. You are going to be well. I will send for Nathaniel," she said. It was the first time she had called him by his name. It stopped him where he sat. "Do not send for anyone. Not yet. Stay a moment." She turned her hand within his so that instead of him holding her she was holding him, and she felt him go still. "You sat with me 3 days. I could do nothing else," he said low. "You could have. Many men would have. You did not." She looked at their joined hands and then up at his face, weary and unshaven and afraid to hope, and she said the things she had come through fire to be sure of. I married a man I was taught to dread, and I have spent these months discovering that everything I dreaded was a lie, and that the truth of you is the kindest thing I have ever known. You told me our wedding night that anything more than strangers would be my choice and mine alone, and that was no hurry. Well, I have chosen Nathaniel. I have chosen you, not because I was made to, because I want to. I should like to be your wife in truth, and not only in name, when I am well and strong and can stand at an altar of my own free will and mean it. That is my choice. I make it freely, with my eyes open, and I make it because I love you, which no one made me do and no one could have. The Duke of Belcourt, the Black Duke, the beast of the border, the most feared man in the north, bowed his head over his wife's hand and wept, openly this time, and did not care that she saw, and when he could speak he said only, you are certain, Eleanor. I could not bear to be wrong about this. I am certain, she said. Come here. And he came, carefully, gently, as he did everything where she was concerned, and he gathered her against him, mindful of her weakness, and held her, and she felt his heart going hard beneath her cheek. And for a long while none of them said anything at all, because there was nothing left that needed saying. She grew strong again through the mild days of that winter, and he tended her back to health as gently as he had fought for her life. He read to her every evening while she was too weak to hold a book. He carried her, when she was still too frail to walk far, out to the south windows on the fine days so that she might have the sun on her face, and set her among cushions like something precious, and sat by her, and they talked, and were quiet, and were content. He courted her, in short. Properly courted her at last, a wife he had married months before, wooing her slowly and gently and with a wonder he made no effort to hide, as though he could not quite believe his good fortune, as though he woke each morning half afraid she would have thought better of it in the night. And Eleanor, watching him court her, understood that she had never in her life been so cherished, and marvelled that it had come to her from the very quarter she had most dreaded, and gave thanks privately for her father's debts, which she could not now regret, for they had bought her, by a strange dark road, the only true happiness she had ever known. They spoke, in those recovering weeks, of everything of the past they had each been carrying, of the fear she had come to him with, and the grief he had carried 7 years, of the children he had thought never to have, and now, tentatively, wonderingly, allowed himself to hope for. He told her one evening that he had not planned to survive his first grief in the black months after his wife and child died, and that only duty had kept him upright, duty and the tenants who needed him, and that he had lived for years as a man lives who is only waiting, without knowing what he waited for. And then a girl came up the aisle white and shaking, he said, and I found out. I had been waiting for you, Eleanor, without the least idea you were coming. 7 years, waiting. I should have waited 70 and thought it well spent. And she had wept a little, and been held, and been glad, and had known herself, for the first time in her life, entirely and completely at home. And in the spring, when she was well and rosy and could laugh again, they were married a second time, quietly, in the little chapel at Belcourt, before no one but Bess and Lady Aurelia and a handful of the tenants they had nursed through the fever. And this time the bride did not come up the aisle white and trembling and unable to look at the man who waited for her. This time Eleanor came up the aisle with her whole heart in her face, and looked at Nathaniel the entire way, and he looked back at her as though she were the only light in a world that had been dark for 7 years, which to him she was. And when the vows were spoken this time they were true, chosen, freely given, and the second wedding night was nothing at all like the first. It was tender and unhurried, and full of a wonder that neither of them had thought their lives would hold. And it was theirs, wholly and only theirs, and it belongs to them. And here the door closes softly upon it, as such doors should, and the fire burns low, and the great house of Belcourt, which had been cold for 7 years, is warm at last. They were happy. It is a plain word, and it does not begin to hold the truth of it, but it is the truest word, and it will have to do. The tales of the beast of the border died away in time, unfed, and new tales grew up in their place, of a duke who had been thawed by love, of a duchess brave enough to walk into a fever at his side, of a great house that opened its gates in sickness and its heart in health. Lady Aurelia, who lived long enough to see it, said that she had prayed 30 years for her nephew's grief to end and had given up hope of it, and that God had answered her at last in the shape of a debtor's frightened daughter, and that she should never doubt again. Bess, who had prayed the same prayer, only smiled, and said she had known from the wedding night, from the sight of his Grace bowing to his terrified bride and sleeping in the dressing room to spare her fear, that this one would be different, and she had been right, and she was very glad of it. And on quiet evenings, when the fire was lit and there were, in time, small quick feet on the stairs and small warm hands to hold, for the house that had lost a child 7 years before was given children at last, and the Duke who had watched one deathbed helpless was granted instead. Cradle-sides full of life, Nathaniel, Duke of Belcourt, would look across the hearth at his wife, who had come to him afraid and stayed by choice, and he would remember the first night and the frightened girl pressed against the wall, and the 3 quiet words he had given her that had turned out to be the truest promise of his life. "You are safe with me." He had said it to calm her fear. He had spent every day since making it more true, and she had made it true in return. So that at last there were 2 people under the roof of Belcourt who were each, entirely and forever, safe with the other, which is, when all the tales are told, and all the fear is spent, the whole of what love is, and the whole of what they had, and it was enough, and it was everything, to the very end of their long and gentle days.